Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Science and Food. I'm Amy Rowett, Professor of Integrative Biology and Physiology here at UCLA and the Marcy H. Rothman Presidential Chair of Food Studies. It's my pleasure to present to you this evening, People, Food, and Climate, thinking holistically about what we eat. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be back after our COVID hiatus to see you all again. This is our 10th year of the Science and Food, mostly annual event series. So as many of you know, the Science and Food events spawned from an undergraduate class that I teach here at UCLA, Science and Food. And the goal with this class and with these public events is to take science, something that's not intuitive to many of us, and explain that with something we all understand, food. We also use food as a platform to foster evidence-based discussions about food and critical social issues from health equity to planetary health, as we're doing tonight. So from the correspondent nonprofit organization, Science and Food at UCLA, and our mission is to promote knowledge of science through food and food through science. Okay, the slides are not advancing here. I don't know if anyone is able to support with that. But before we get started, I wanted to highlight how all of the initiatives that we're working on in both research and teaching and outreach rely on your support and partnership. This is especially important tonight, which marks the 10th anniversary of our Science and Food events, which launched back in 2012. So maybe you were here at the 2012 original series where we had chefs building, heard from chefs building experimental research labs, like Renee Redzepi, who came and whizzed up some fermented cricket cakes, and also sent our team on a wild sand flea foraging expedition. That's another story. You might have been here in 2017 when you learned about scientific perspectives on food waste with Chef Massimo Bottura and UCLA professor Jenny Jay. Or maybe you got to drink Tang and learn about how engineers are inventing ways to grow food in extreme environments like space in our last 2019 event. Even though you haven't heard from us in the past couple of years, we've been very busy during the pandemic working with the LA Unified School District and colleagues to design food-based science curriculum to meet the need to engage students in remote learning. But your support for Science and Food over the years has really created a truly vibrant food culture here on campus that's advancing research, education, and community engagement initiatives and enabling us to attract federal and state funding to support our research and education. So during the past 10 years, there's been tremendous growth in food-related programming at UCLA, from the expansion of the Semel Healthy Campus Initiative Center to the Food Studies minor, which Science and Food is a key course in, to the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy, to the new Rothman Institute, Rothman Family Institute for Food Studies, which was launched earlier this year. So with support from you and our partners, we're delighted that tonight's event is free in celebration of Science and Food's 10th birthday. But don't let that stop you, that if you really like what we do and you can still contribute, there's more information on that on scienceandfood.org on how you can make a tax-deductible donation. So in addition to your support, I'd also like to acknowledge the support of some important people. So tonight's event would not have been possible without Mel Liu for their amazing energy in organizing all aspects of the event this evening. Our team of core volunteers, like to shout out to Claudio DeFaz, Pia Paloma, and Charlotte Vo, Wendy Slusser and Rochelle Crosby for their unwavering support and vision for these events. Also extremely grateful for our partners, the LA Times FoodBowl, CNSI, the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy at UCLA, the UC Office of the President's Global Food Initiative, and the INFEWS training program, which is supported by the National Science Foundation. So yes, thank you to all of our partners. The past decade of Science and Food has also been incredibly rich, thanks to the late Jonathan Gold, foremost food critic and visionary who we miss dearly. Jonathan has been a constant source of inspiration and support for Science and Food since the beginning days of our series. Just as Jonathan so admirably opened up dialogue among our diverse LA community through food, he brought that same spirit of curiosity about science and food into the public domain. I'm forever grateful, and especially grateful to continue to be able to work with his family, Lori Ochoa, and the LA Times FoodBowl, Angus Dillon, and Ann Huffman. So tonight's topic, people, food, and climate, is at the forefront of many of our current conversations around food. It is one of our greatest societal challenges to make sure that everyone has access to nutrient-rich food that also supports human and planetary health. Many of us have already experienced the fragilities in our food supply chains that are happening through pandemics and war and extreme climate events, which are only going to increase in frequency. Today, President Biden hosted the monumental White House conference on hunger, nutrition, and health for the first time in more than half a century, with the vision to end hunger and reduce diet-related disease by 2030, while also closing disparities among communities that are impacted most. So for many reasons, this topic is extremely timely. So let's get on with the show. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the speakers. I'll call them up to the stage, and they can take their seats in our chairs here on the podium, and I'll introduce them. So speakers, come on up. So Paula Daniels is our first speaker I'm going to introduce, who's co-founder, chief of What's Next, and founding chair of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. She's a lawyer who has held a number of senior executive positions in government on water policy in California and LA. She's also served as senior advisor on food policy to Mayor Villaraigosa of Los Angeles, and taught food and water policy at UCLA for several years. Did I do okay on the pronunciation? Thank you. Thank you. Paula always corrects me. Thank you. So next, we're delighted that Jorge Gaviria is here with us today. Jorge is the founder of Macienda, a supplier of high-quality masa and masa products. The company is at the center of the heirloom masa movement in the U.S. Jorge is trained in top restaurants, including Danny Meyer's Maialino and Blue Hill at Stone Barns, before founding his company in 2014. He's also been widely recognized by top media outlets for his work, and was awarded Forbes 30 Under 30 for Food and Wine in 2017. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Paige Stanley. Paige is a postdoctoral researcher in the Quattrufo Soil Innovation Lab, Department of Soil and Crop Sciences at Colorado State University. Her expertise is on understanding how grazing management can sequester carbon in soils to help mitigate climate change. Using a truly interdisciplinary approach, Paige draws on a wide range of disciplines in her work, including soil biogeochemistry, agroecology, grazing and rangeland ecology, all the way to political ecology. So Paige has a bachelor's of science in biology and economics, MS in animal science, and also PhD in environmental science. Next up, we have Christian Stainer, who's a founding partner of Stainer Architects, a Los Angeles-based design practice. He's also co-founder of the restaurants Bachetti and Tilda. Christian received his master's in architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and his BA in architecture and human rights theory from Harvard College and the experimental liberal arts institution, Deep Springs College, where he also gained experience working in agriculture, working on a 350-head cow-calf operation, as well as studies of open-range desert feeding approaches. So he brings really relevant expertise to the conversation this evening from many angles. Stainer Architects is a LGBTQ-led practice engaging exclusively with projects by nonprofit public benefit organizations such as schools, arts, and culture organizations. I hope Christian will also share more about Tools and Utensils, which is an amazing online resource for educational, cultural, and philanthropic institutions looking to advance the future of food on their campuses. Okay, and then finally, the conversation tonight is going to be moderated by the esteemed Professor Aaron Blaisdell. Dr. Blaisdell is a UCLA professor of psychology and neuroscience and a member of the Brain Research Institute, the Integrative Center for Learning and Memory, and the Evolutionary Medicine Program. He received a BA and MS in anthropology, a PhD in behavioral neuroscience, and completed postdoctoral training at Tufts University. And he also leads the, the Ancestral Health organization as well. Yeah. So tonight's event is a panel discussion. We're going to begin with each speaker providing a 5-minute overview of their perspective on our topic as policy, food scientist, and architect food expert.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction.
All right. So
Thank you. So, as you know, my name is Paula Daniels, and I co-founded the Center for Good Food Purchasing. And the reason we founded it was in order to flip the script on the problems in our food system. So, Anthony, I'm sorry, we're going to hear about what the problems in the food system are, but we want to flip the script on 5 key issue areas, which are the decimation to local food economies and farming, environmental sustainability issues, fair labor, animal welfare, and nutritional health. So we created a program that was designed around a theory of change, of working with large institutions. We all can make a difference, and we know that, and that's one of the premises of this panel. We can each make a difference in our choices. Just think if the institutional food market did. It's $120 billion of a food market, and we decided we wanted to influence that market, and we created a program within the city of LA, which was signed by Mayor Villaraigosa 10 years ago in October of 2012 on Good Food Day, and then adopted by LA Unified School District to start shifting their massive purchasing dollars. LA Unified School District, $150 million food budget a year, pretty much, start shifting that toward food that flipped the script, that was supportive of these values that we care so much about. So we were able to do that and make some immediate changes with LA Unified School District. They, in local purchasing, for example, went from less than 10% local sourcing of produce to an average of 60%. They redirected $12 million into the local food economy. Their vendors started sourcing wheat for their baked goods from sustainable sources. It started having these ripple effects that we wanted to have. So there was attention to this. We're now the Center for Good Food Purchasing. We are a national organization, and we've now spread across the United States, and we're in 25 cities across the U.S. It includes the 3 top cities, LA, of course, being the second largest, but also New York. Mayor Adams, now mayor of New York, signed an executive order reinforcing his department's enrollment in our program. We're in Chicago. I'm from Hawaii. We recently were part of an initiative by the city and county of Honolulu, the mayor of Honolulu, for an Oahu Good Food program. We're in Denver. We're in Cincinnati. Oh, here's our slides. Why don't we go to a next one? I think probably the third one after this. That's the theory of change. You influence the institution, influences the local food economy, influences the global economy. That's the idea. We start a smaller wheel and turn that wheel and turn the bigger wheel and turn the bigger wheel. Next slide, please. And this is a map, so you can just sort of get a visual of where we are throughout the country now. So we're in 60 institutions. That includes schools, hospitals, municipal institutions. Public spending for the public good is our mantra. These are public dollars in these municipal institutions. It should be directed toward the public good. Next slide, please. So this is an example of how we provide, and I wanted to show this to you so you can see our method of operating is with using data, transparency, and accountability. So once they know how they're purchasing food, how can they then start making shifts? And those who care about it and who want to hold them accountable are armed with this information as well. So a school board, an advocacy group, this information can be available to them so that they can work with the school districts and other institutions to make the changes. So in this hypothetical example, this institution was doing well on local economies, not so much on environmental sustainability or humane treatment of animals, but good on fair labor and nutrition. So we give them that information. Actually, we collect their information and do analysis, and we give it to them to the dollar that they spend, so they can see how much they're spending at each vendor and start and know more about that vendor and make changes based on that. Next slide, please. This is just a way we can broadcast to them and to other institutions in the region how they're doing. The bar charts show their comparative analysis with other institutions, so they can benchmark against others and maybe even cooperate. We're all the various institutions in one city are enrolled in this program. How can they start, making shifts together? Is one approach. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm from Hawaii. I also have a podcast, which just launched this month. I'm mentioning this because 30% is the name. The 30% Project is the name of the podcast. Why 30%, you may ask? Because what we'd like to get to is having all major institutions, food service institutions in a region commit to having 30% of their purchasing in this direction. And what a difference would that make, right? Hawaii already has that goal. Hawaii has an Aloha Plus Challenge goal, which they started about 8 years ago, where they want to double their local food production in Hawaii by 2030, which would mean getting to 30%. But that 30% is meaningful for Hawaii because local food is a matter of survival as well in Hawaii because they're being hit by hurricanes. And with supply chain disruptions, Hawaii is very vulnerable, being 2,500 miles from any major landmass. So 30% means a lot to Hawaii, but it's the number that we think is important for other regions as well, starting with Hawaii, but I think their example resonates. Hawaii, for example, has a lot of land that's been locked up in industrial monoculture for sugar and pineapple in the 19th and 20th centuries. But guess what? Iowa has the same problem. A lot of their land is locked up for corn and other production, and they're having a hard time getting their local food numbers up to the same degree that Hawaii has. They have some of the same challenges, land, access to land, et cetera. So we think these examples will resonate, and I hope if you sign up, it's also on Apple Podcasts, but for those of you who don't have an iPhone, it's on Radio Public. There's some interesting examples from these practitioners in Hawaii. 30%, next slide please, is also a number we used in an analysis we did on the true cost of school meals, which is building on the concept of the true cost of food needing to balance the scales because food is artificially cheap right now. A lot of, especially the mass industrial produced food, artificially cheap because the negative externalities are pushed off onto society. All the problems that I told you about pushed off into society. And we pay for it. We all pay for it one way or the other. It's not shown on the sticker price of the food, but we pay for it in cleanup, in depressed wages that impact society, all of that. So a study was done by the Rockefeller Foundation on the true cost of the U.S. food system, which I highly recommend you look at. It's very illuminating. The true cost of the food system, U.S. food system, is 3 times the external cost as the actual cost of the U.S. food system. We did this follow-up study on the true cost of school meals and found that, by and large, it gives good benefits in health and poverty reduction. But next slide, please. If you were to get to 30% of purchasing on all school meals, you could make some significant changes. So we made an analysis based on all the data we have from the 63 institutions that we look at. We have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of data. We've done some modeling. We have an impact hub. If you want to take a look at that, it's available, Impact Hub, Good Food Purchasing. You can find it that way. But these are the benefits you could get. Next slide, please, and I'm almost done. You would actually get an increase in wages in the local economy. You would get a reduction in greenhouse gases and water use. You'd get a reduction in pesticide use to the numbers that are shown on this slide if all the school meals were at that 30% number. So that's a number I want you to think about as maybe a goal that we could get to. And next slide, please. Imagine the impact. Thank you.
Is this working? You hear me in the back? Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Paula. One of us, we were just joking about this earlier, one of us does not belong here and is highly underqualified, and I'll let you guess who that is in just a moment. We can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, we're going to use pictures. So my name's Jorge Gaviria. I'm the founder of Macienda, and kind of in a nutshell, philosophy and kind of where I come from and why I'm here. I was working in fine dining in New York for a couple of years for some folks who, were heroes to me and at the time really were, I think, causing me to reflect on the food that I grew up eating. I grew up in a Latin community in Miami. My mom was born in Mexico. My dad was born in Cuba. It's a pretty eclectic Latin community at that in Miami if you've ever been there. Spanish is the primary language. I think working for farm-to-table restaurants in New York and just sort of that attention to detail, I realized that the foods that I grew up eating were largely underrepresented in this conversation. And I really wanted to see a change in a platform that could really affect active consumption around, Latin foods. I think start to drive change from a supply chain perspective, curiosity and connection to source and people. What better place to start than the tortilla, or masa. Masa is the connective tissue really across Latin America. If you've ever had, raise your hand if you've ever had a taco. Yeah. Tamal. Great. Yeah. So you've all had masa. Masa is the Spanish word for dough, but it is more specifically dough that is driven by or created by corn that goes through this really, really amazing alchemy process called nixtamalization. It's kind of a fancy word. It's just basically corn that cooks in an alkaline solution that makes it like super nutritious, goes from being an empty calorie to something very nutritious and tasty. And once it's ground, it becomes masa. So this seemed like a really worthwhile place to start, given its sort of relationship with so many Latin cultures, Mexico, of course, being a really key driver of that. And my goal at the time was to start a tartine bakery equivalent of a tortilleria, basically. So like, just like a temple for tortillas, and everyone could see this whole process, and it would just like make everybody really excited to do this at home. And, I don't know what came next. That was it. But in the process of trying to kind of create a supply chain that really spoke to, I think, masa and its history and its food way, there was not a lot to ironically show for this experience in the United States. The United States is by far and away the largest producer of corn in the world by a landslide. And yet the food way, it doesn't really, it's mostly kind of related to frankenfood when we think of corn in the US, right? It's more of a problem than it is a solution to anything. And so if you trace back the origins of corn, you go to Mexico. This is literally Mexico, modern day Mesoamerica, invented corn. Its entire genetic supply is any type of corn you've ever eaten comes from Mexico in some way or another. So it seemed like a pretty logical place to start building a supply chain. And in the process of trying to connect with folks, across the NGO space, folks who had something to say about corn and, in a post-industrial world, it turned out that there were 3 million smallholder farmers that maintain this kind of open genetic diversity of maize in the world. Like literally everything that we take for granted today, from Syngenta to like yellow number 2 corn, has its roots in Mexico, and it's being openly sort of exploited for that genetic diversity. And so I thought it would be kind of an interesting twist in a post-NAFTA world to start sourcing corn from smallholder subsistence farmers in Mexico, import that corn to the United States, and then figure out kind of what to do with it from there. And so that was in 2014. Started with a tortilla. So basically going into, farmers' homes, realizing that the power, I think, for change really was in the flavor. Just the unbelievable pleasure I got from eating, in these homes and sharing meals around masa with, these farming communities that were largely dependent on traditional regenerative agriculture. There was a direct correlation between the type of agriculture that was supporting this amazing flavor and the pleasure I got from it. And so my job was to connect that supply chain with chefs, maybe one day a tortilleria, which, by the way, spoiler alert, never opened, and just sort of build this value chain from the ground up. We can go to the next slide. Just an example, Don Luceño is one of our farmers that we work with. I started in 2014 working with about 12 farmers. And these are all subsistence farmers, which is different from kind of what we think about from like a coffee grower. These are folks who grow for their own household consumption. And so when I founded Macienda, the goal was to really support surplus, what should I say, a market for surplus crops from year to year that could be purchased at highly competitive, rates relative to the Chicago Board of Trade, which controls the commodity corn price at any given day, and just really have them be an integral part of the solution to better corn in the world, better masa in the world. Today we work with about 2,000 smallholder farmers across 6 different states in Mexico, and are growing that every year over year. We can go to the next slide. This is just a pretty picture of how masa is ground up. We can talk about that later. We can go to the next slide. And yeah, so I guess the process from start to finish of making masa is quite a labor-intensive one. One of the goals for me was to really drive a lot of awareness with high-end chefs. So our first customers included, Enrique Olvera, Rick Bayless, Jose Andres, Sean Brock, Rene Redzepi, folks who had a large platform that could sort of share and sort of ignite this curiosity about this food that we have clearly all eaten, but maybe haven't really thought very much about how it's made. And eventually create consumer packaged goods that can sort of, I think, memorialize that momentum that was being driven around the conversation. So starting in restaurants, I literally would sell corn door to door, and show chefs how to make masa from scratch. And then eventually we started to do consumer packaged goods and kind of created an entire platform, kind of like a Williams-Sonoma meets like a, I don't know, Mexico, kind of in between. Still trying to work on the elevator pitch, but that's what we do. And really the goal is to celebrate the richness of the Mexican kitchen and all the culture that surrounds it. I think masa is a way to connect cultures, through food, and the food way extends well beyond Mexico, well beyond Central America. It's a global phenomenon. So I think it speaks for itself. Go to the next slide. And here to plug a book. I think about 9 years now into the process of launching Masienda and kind of trying to really steward this conversation and conscious consumption, active consumption around this major staple. One of the things I realized was grossly missing was a text. You could not make masa unless you were really lucky enough to have a family member who could show you how to do it. It was a very oral tradition. And so to me, part of the work over the last 9 years has been to document how to do this, working with chefs, working with artisans, working with tortillerias across the country and the world, to kind of connect all these dots and kind of map out a really easy, beautiful book on making masa. So thanks for letting me be here. Thanks for letting me celebrate it. And yeah. Go next. Who should go next? Oh, Paige? Yeah. Microphone up there.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Amy, for the introduction. My name's Paige. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Colorado State University. I do science for a living. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you guys about the intersection of science and regenerative agriculture and climate change. So Aaron will introduce us to kind of issues with industrial agriculture that I'm sure many people are familiar with, but kind of two aspects that keep me up at night and that really drive my work are these two numbers that I have pasted here. So one is that 14% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the livestock industry. The second is that 50% of soil organic carbon has been lost on our agricultural lands in some cases. So this is carbon that was stored down deep in soils in agricultural lands like cropping and grazing lands that have been released into the atmosphere through industrial agricultural practices and have made a pretty big impact on our climate footprint. So I have degrees in several disparate fields, but I'm either a jack of all trades or a master of none, depending on how you look at it. But I pull on a lot of different disciplines to understand kind of how we move forward with regenerative agriculture and its potential to help us sequester carbon and mitigate climate change. I approach these questions really holistically. So I use natural experimental methods, actually measuring soil carbon outcomes of different regenerative agricultural practices on farms and ranches across the country. I do lab experiments and incubations. I'm growing forage right now in a stable isotope labeling chamber. Really just a science nerd. But I actually, right now in the lab that I'm working with, have a really cool opportunity to work with a huge interdisciplinary group of scientists across the world, where we're trying to look at the impacts of regenerative grazing on soil carbon sequestration and how we can bring these solutions to scale across the country. My research really centers around three core questions. One is, how can we sequester carbon on grass and rangelands? Rangelands take up about 40% of Earth's ice-free terrestrial surface. So that is a big opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff and bring carbon that has been respired into the atmosphere back into soils and to close the soil carbon deficit that we've created. And because these are agricultural landscapes, I mean, the main agricultural activity taking place on grass and rangelands is grazing. And so, depending on how these lands are managed, they can either contribute to climate change through carbon dioxide emissions, or it can help us mitigate climate change through soil carbon sequestration. And grazing animals is our primary tool of doing that on grass and rangelands. And the last question is, what does this mean for our food system? How much meat, beef can we produce using these practices that we know to be beneficial in creating resilient agroecosystems? And what does that mean for the level of consumption that we can support compared to the level of consumption that we have right now? So through my research results, research experience, my education, working with policymakers, and collaborating with farmers and ranchers across the country, I've kind of come to understand 5 key truths in my mind that seem really important as we do this panel today and consider all of your questions. One is that not all meat is bad, not all beef is bad. Animals have been a part of agroecosystems for thousands of years, but the negative environmental consequences that we often associate with meat and beef in general is the product of industrial production and human mismanagement. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And there's a little kind of quote that I like to use from a rancher and author actually based here in California named Nicolette Nyman. She says, "It's not the cow, it's the how." So it's a lot about how we're doing these things that matters to the environmental outcomes that we're trying to produce. And my research results actually suggest that we need grazing in order to maximize the potential for soil carbon sequestration on grass and rangelands throughout the world. We're actually seeing quite high rates of soil carbon sequestration using regenerative grazing systems. And we need more soil carbon sequestration because we cannot reach our climate change mitigation goals of staying below 2 degrees warming with only reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We also have to be actively pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and soils is our main leverage tool on how to do that. It's our main natural climate solution. And these solutions aren't mutually exclusive. So we can tackle issues of industrial animal agriculture on the consumption side, thinking about how we can reduce our levels of meat consumption to be more within our planetary consumption boundaries, but also thinking about how we actively change the way we're producing meat and beef in these agroecosystems to better support ecosystem services like soil carbon sequestration, biodiversity, water holding capacity, in addition to food provisioning. So it's all important to consider together. And then lastly, in my perspective, policy change is so crucial. Policy helped create the issues that we have around industrial agriculture right now. And in my mind, it'll be important to think critically and holistically about how we create policy for the future of food that we want to see. That's all I have, and I look forward to answering y'all's questions.
Hello, I'm the last person, so I'll be as brief as possible. About 8 years ago, I was teaching at the University of Michigan and watching the emergence of a number of visual technologies become very dominant within the architectural field. I'm not a scientist by any stretch, but the emergence of Instagram and Tumblr and a sort of ocular fascination that architecture had with the image as the primary means of experiencing a space or of a city, and became very interested in other ways of experiencing space, such as smell and atmosphere and temperature, humidity, taste, but realized that there wasn't a sort of language around that existed within the design and art world around smell, olfaction, taste, and found a vocabulary for that through wine and through perfume, of all places, where they had actually come up with ways of describing smells and tastes that generally we don't, we're not introduced to. We don't have that visual, non-visual language to draw on. From that, teaching around production, landscapes of production, primarily around wine, I ended up owning a wine bar that was specifically focused on California natural biodynamic produced wine, and run an architecture practice of 9 people that we are focused on looking at new spaces or new building typologies where food, sort of the future food could take place. And initially our thought was that the university campus was the place that this was sort of gonna unfold, that you have new sort of interdisciplinary, multi-departmental programs such as NYU or here at UCLA that stretch across the humanities and the sciences into the medical school and so forth. And what is the facility that they need in order to sort of teach and educate it and provide a pedagogical space for what the food system of 30% or the landscapes of rangelands could be. And so that's been our primary activity. We also do own and operate some more sort of conventional restaurants. And so I've really seen the full range of the food system from being involved in agricultural production through to trying to figure out the design of spaces for let's say the cultural as well as the production of food, so commercial kitchens and then into sort of supply chain and procurement issues very much at a small scale, not at LAUSD, but at an individual, but even at the small scale, there are some incredible challenges when you try to exist outside of the Cisco US Foods model of procurement. If you could continue down. We also work with this, for example, we're doing some community engagement work with Hollywood Food Coalition, which runs a food waste diversion and feeding program where they provide low-income and unhoused community members in Hollywood with free meals. So we're working on effectively a free restaurant that will help to capture food that would otherwise go into the waste stream. And again, a policy issue a couple of years ago, City of Los Angeles instituted a policy that intended to reduce the amount of food, which is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in terms of methane and the amount of food that goes into landfill. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's enormous. You would be or should be embarrassed by how much of the food that is actually grown and transported and processed ends up in the trash. If you could go on to the next slide. Okay, 42%. We also work on or are developing some integrated projects in which, for me, one of the really compelling aspects of looking at food systems from an architectural perspective is that there's a lot of, let's say, models that have been put in place for transparency or certification that the construction trades are very much trying to work through, whether it's LEED certification or a recent emergence in considering the sourcing and use of slave labor in construction-related components like the production of screws and nails and so forth outside of the US, is that we are one of the most heavily regulated industries, whereas the food systems are one of the least regulated industries. But there's actually a number of overlapping regulatory bodies that connect between the two of them. So National Science Foundation, Intertech, and others that have come up with standards and are increasingly sort of bridging between the built environment and actually how food is produced and distributed. If you go to the last slide, I think it is. And then a pitch for, we don't have a book, but we do have a website that we've been looking at best practices and approaches for how higher education primarily can start to think about where food fits into their physical campus. So as I mentioned, we thought that the university was going to be the place that this took place. And what we discovered was, despite the intense consideration of reducing the environmental impact that the university has, to the extent of, for instance, Boston University buying an entire wind farm, I think it's in either North or South Dakota, to offset their emissions, that food, which is one of the most sort of central elements to both the campus experience for students and for faculty, but also one of the most, potentially or polluting and unjust systems that exist within the university campus really hasn't been looked at all yet. And so our mission right now is we're trying to figure out ways that the built environment can in some ways advance some of these policy and environmental goals that the more intelligent people in the panel have figured out.
All right, this is on. You can hear me, I think. Okay, thanks. I'll try and be brief with my brief intro. Why am I, a psychologist, neuroscientist, on moderating a panel about food, climate, and people? I've always been a naturalist at heart. I studied animals or caught animals when I was a kid and studied them. Thought they were really cool. I went to college, and of course, I gravitated towards evolution, biology, anthropology. But then it was working with living primates that I got a chance to do as an undergraduate that really, I realized how interesting the mind behind the eyes of the animal are. And so I pivoted and started studying the evolution of the mind by studying animal cognition. And that's what brought me to become a professor here at UCLA, where I study the evolution of the mind and the brains that support those minds. And it was that was one pivot in my life. The second was about 13, 14 years ago, I discovered the paleo diet and tried it out of curiosity, and it worked wonders for my health, physical and mental health, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And so I started digging back into my old anthropology notes and saying, well, how do hunter-gatherers eat? And I didn't remember reading much about that, and I started really diving into the intersection of evolution, human evolution, and diet and nutrition. And so I got really passionate about that. In fact, I even started, as Amy mentioned in the opening remarks, a society called the Ancestral Health Society. The idea is looking at human health in the modern times from the perspective of evolutionary mismatch, in particular human evolution. And so we have a conference every year. It started here at UCLA in 2011. It's been going almost every year since then, where we bring people to talk about that topic. And these kinds of issues would come up frequently at that event. So that's a nice little, I guess, brief enough. I'll reset my, well, I'm practiced at doing this. So to frame, so that's me, and that's why I'm here, is I'm just geeking out on this, and I think it's a hugely important topic. And so we assembled a great audience, a great panel here, and a great audience, by the way. And so this slide here is a little bit cut weird, but anyway, it frames the problem and solution that we're going to be talking about with members on the panel here. You've already heard about industrial agriculture, like monocropping and confined or concentrated animal feed operations being very problematic in many ways, even though there are a lot of benefits to those. And regenerative agriculture, biodynamic farming, cultivating heirloom varieties of plants is maybe part of the solution to reduce the problems of industrial agriculture, like pollution and fragility that they produce, and to allow for sequestering more carbon, sequestering more water retention, increasing species diversity, and improving topsoil and growing back topsoil, which is a real key part, as Paige already mentioned, to solving this carbon problem. And so that's that side of the right side of the screen is where we're trying to move towards and finding ways there. And so the how do we do that? How do we achieve some of these changes? And that's where the panelists will intersect all of these different areas of how food, people, and climate become involved. That's with soil science, horticulture, the restaurant industry, policy and government, built environments, and just complex systems thinking. And so that's the orienting slide. And now what we're going to do now is turn to kind of questions and answers among the panel members. And I've got already a list of some questions that we started with. I think there are more coming.
Right, so there
Great. So I'm going to just start with one of the ones that we were brainstorming earlier. And I am going to start with Paige, because I think that it's really kind of the center of a lot of what's going on is this idea of this term regenerative agriculture. You already talked a little bit about that with your talk. Could you maybe expand and maybe clarify in a very broad sense what that term means?
Sure. Is this working? Yeah. So I can't say that there's really a scientific consensus right now on what regenerative agriculture means. There's actually been several review articles like, what does it mean? We can define it along practices or kind of philosophies. I like to think of regenerative agriculture as being synonymous with agroecology. And we think of agroecology in terms of 3 pillars: science, practice, and movement. So I think, considering it all as a whole is really important, because it also makes it so that we don't leave out some of the broader movement and policy things that should be incorporated in regenerative agriculture. But kind of the on-the-ground practices are based around soil health principles. So things like keeping soil covered, increasing the diversity of things that we're growing, utilizing integrated crop livestock systems, things like that. And those inform a set of practices that are able to be utilized by farmers and ranchers. It's different than ad hoc practices that are often used in terms of conservation agriculture. So I like to think of it in terms of suites of practices. Just doing no-till or just using cover crops or just using integrated crop livestock systems will not get us to a regenerative agricultural system. It's more about using practices that are synergistic to one another to reach the goals that we want, to sequester more carbon, to retain more water, to create more resiliency within the food system. Using those practices together that create those outcomes along the soil health principles is about how I would think of the practices.
If I could just follow on with my own question based on what you just said.
Sure.
To what degree, it sounds like this is an ecology, like somebody with a degree in ecology studying how ecosystems work in the real world, and that what regenerative agriculture, the way that you're trying to frame it, is about understanding ecological systems and trying to manage them that way. Is that kind of a good way to think about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, agroecology is the application of ecological principles to agricultural systems, and that's how that kind of body of disciplinary work emerged. So, I mean, it's not specific to either genre, but it's important to understanding that system as a whole, I feel.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And Paula, it sounds like you want to jump in here.
Well, I mean, I think regenerative agriculture is definitely an important way to go. And I don't know if Paige has a number for how much acreage we would need to have in order to make a difference from a climate change standpoint. That's still probably being worked out. What I think we all need to do is to create markets for regenerative agriculture, because right now it's very, very, very small percent of the market out there. Maybe you can get regeneratively grown beef at a restaurant, but it's going to be really hard to get it in a retail store, and it might be more expensive. We do have this question of cost. And we'd like to get it so that it's more available in institutions. So there's lots of levers that need to be pulled in order to make that happen. And I think the way we manage our program with the institutions is we point them to existing certifications. So, for example, USDA Organic, Equitable Food Initiative certified, Fair Labor certified, et cetera. The existing labels that you can read on a label in the grocery store, they can buy them at scale. And with that kind of purchasing power, there's been changes. Like organic food has grown tremendously. There's a tremendous amount of it on the market now compared to when it came out in the 1990s. I remember trying to buy organic food in the 1990s. There wasn't very much. And now you can get it on a lot of labels, right? Regenerative agriculture, in my view, there needs to be a certification for it. And there are some efforts underway for regenerative ag. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that, because you're going back and forth. But,
I'd love to chat on that too, because we had bad experiences with that.
Okay, let's talk about it. But the reason I say that is it would make it easier for consumer, including a large institution, to make a decision. And I know there's a regenerative organic certification program underway that Patagonia is part of, and some others. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's a good start, not to throw shade at anybody in the Regenerative Organic Alliance or whatever, ROC. Yeah. So you have to satisfy, two of the three sort of like pillars. It's social impact, environmental impact, and I think animal husbandry impacts, which didn't apply to Hacienda. But, when in the case of working with smallholder producers who are by and large, produce, I think, the most sustainable forms of agriculture in the world. But it's certainly in Mexico where the genesis of the milpa system is and still practiced today. We are working with folks who are living below the international poverty line, who are averaging about 5 hectares of production, per family. It was amazing to me that despite going through all of the kind of the hoops, first of all, organic as a certification, we did not qualify because of how small the farms were. There was no interest in actually going to some of these farms. Farms is a bit of a misnomer. Family, plots of land in very rural parts of the world. So that was really difficult to satisfy. And then on the fair trade side, I actually asked Paul Rice, founder of, I think it was Fair Trade USA, and another fair trade entity. I said, what does it take to get corn recognized as a fair trade crop? And they said, it's a little small. It doesn't actually qualify. It's not a significant enough commodity to really warrant our efforts, which basically meant like doesn't seem like there's very much money in heirloom corn or whatever we were doing. So I put the response, if you want to see it, on Hacienda.com, of what Paul Rice said, not to be polemical, but just to say, like, for smaller production, which is where I think a lot of really great work is being done, there's not a sort of a certification platform that meets it where it's at.
This is a well-known issue, yeah, and that it is difficult for small farms and those with not enough funding to get to certification, which is why there are programs now that the USDA funds for transition to organic, so they can help with the organic certification because it's most well-known and an identifiable standard. But without that, how do you want to get to scale?
I mean, we work with within a network of about 3 million farmers. So there's plenty of scale in terms of production and surplus production. It just doesn't quite look like the type of consolidated sort of like built-in efficiencies that you would expect from scaled agriculture in the U.S.
Yeah, I see. So, but how would a consumer know to buy your product, in other words?
Great branding, digital advertising. I think the similar go-to-market strategies that we're seeing for most kind of newer age brands today.
Yeah, I'll just chime in a little bit here. The policy side of my brain wants to be like, yeah, let's get a certification. Let's get some carrots and sticks involved in this. But I also want to recognize that there are trade-offs to any type of certification. For farmers and ranchers to be involved in an organic certification, it makes sense because they're going to get a market premium for their product. Organic is one of the very few food labels who has gotten up to any kind of, market buy-in. It's an easily recognizable standard that people see everywhere now. On the other hand, when the organic certification was going through the policy codification process, it also lost a lot of its teeth. So, in order to get that industry, that corporate buy-in, it got very watered down. And so now we're seeing a lot of the science come out to say, like, maybe some of these organic practices aren't actually great for its climate footprint, for the soil carbon stuff. And so how can we, I would almost want to frame that as a buy-in. Like, what can we learn from the pitfalls of the organic certification process that we can make a possible regenerative certification better?
I'd echo that. I was on the National Organic Standards Board when there is some watering down, but it still does indicate something in terms of production practices. So,
if I could also jump in as moderator, this is a great discussion to start with, and it's what? I didn't hear that. But one thing it reminds me of is that if I can make an analogy, we know that in ecosystems, they're healthier when they're supporting a diversity of species and a diversity of niches, even at the level in the soil, for example, of the soil biome and fungi and things like that. And then jumping to the landscape of big business and policy, it seems like oftentimes policy is a great intention, but it can come with these problems of everybody then fits to a certain standard, and that standard might be set pretty high for larger businesses that can meet them, with smaller scale industries have trouble maybe meeting them. And one thing that I encountered with this is going to the farmer's market here in LA, wanting to buy meat from a vendor that they have their own ranch. They're using more the kind of Allen Savory kind of or multi-paddock raising type of style of raising beef in a regenerative agricultural sense, but they're not allowed to butcher their own product. They have to send it to these large butchers, that's where their animals have to be. So, and then they usually get it back, and it's sometimes hard to tell if they're getting their own animals back from those sites. So this idea that there are tightly regulated market aspects of the markets that are acting as a constraint. They're there initially probably for protection and standardization, but at the same time, they can really, as like an ecosystem that lost diversity, you're having a landscape of the economy that's lost diversity. I'm wondering how we can speak to that in this panel. And probably, Paul, you have
and
a
I'm
lot
probably talking too much, but I just want to point out that you raise an absolutely correct point, and this is partly why we want to create the scale for at least enough market so there's viability in some of these other systems. But what has to rise up to meet that also is the supply chain. And what you mentioned in terms of processing is an issue that this USDA has recognized, and they have put hundreds of millions of dollars into recognizing the need to decentralize meat packing and processing. And there is now money out there for more local processing. So those sorts of supply chain infrastructure needs are very important. Like, our side creates institutional demand. We don't insist that everything be certified, but it is the best way for an institution to make a decision about it. But there are other ways to do it as well. If they were to add, say, a value chain coordinator or a farm to school coordinator, then they can make decisions to buy food that may not be in that range. We can still say that it's good, but the infrastructure needs to meet that. So that means aggregation and distribution. It means local processing. It means warehousing. It means all sorts of infrastructure needs to be built up around what I'm going to call mid-scale level. So right now, a lot of regenerative organic is what I'm going to call artisanal, and maybe think of it as a bicycle lane, right? And the rest of it is this global super highway with spaceships and everything else. It's like that fast, it's moving that fast and too far out of, But if we created a mid-scale level, I think that's where I'd like to see us get.
Well, actually, that's a great response, and thank you for that. And I was actually going to pepper Christian with a question next. And it's actually one of the questions from the audience, which is great. And I think I want you to start off with a response to this. And the question is, how can we make decisions and lifestyle changes on an everyday individual basis to become more sustainable as people and a planet? And so that everybody here, I'm sure, has answers, responses to that, but I want to give you an opportunity first. And maybe from your lens of restaurateurs and architecture intersection, like an urban environment.
Yeah, I think in a way it goes back to some of the markets that are created or are not created. So I maybe in response to that, think about a friend of mine who was running a very small scale meat operation in Louisiana outside of New Orleans, producing primarily for restaurants who would buy the product once, keep the name on the menu, and then go to a conventional producer when they needed more of the product while maintaining that identity of the specialty product that was being produced. So I think one of the big sort of concerns is sort of research or knowledge as to where things go, and in natural wine it's been a major issue because there isn't or hasn't been a scale of production that small producers can buy into or get the certification at tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for CCOC or other types of organic certification. And so a lot of it is built on trust and knowing sort of where something is produced and who buy and what the processes are. And we were talking previously that one of the great sort of examples of when that trust falls apart was Bel Campo and the whole branding that was produced around the local and environmental business practices that was in theory going to allow us to feel okay with eating more red meat because of how it was being produced. There's a similar example of that in Italy about 2 years ago, where there was a producer in Puglia of natural wine who was caught up in a major labor law violation. Calcarius is the name of the brand. And so I think that one of the big sort of questions about how to scale this is in absence of regulation that is imposed top down, which in the building trades, we have a lot of that. I mean, the example of the California Air Quality Boards that have instituted low VOC requirements over the last couple decades has produced a market for paints and other types of finishes that didn't exist before, because there was that regulatory requirement that was put in place. And now you have water-based paints and stuff that are sold throughout the entire US. So I think the short of it is maybe there's a way to require certain types of sourcing processes that should be imposed upon restaurants, and that cost be sort of part of the requirements or experience to dining out, which I'm sure most people would not. Restaurateurs famously feel at the mercy of many different forces. But in absence of that, there's not really a lot to keep people sort of honest or in place to actually what those sourcing processes that seem to be the only means to affecting change could be.
I see, yeah, and that's always a problem with a capitalist system. As all the benefits it has, also has these downsides, where profit motives might drive dishonesty as much as it drives honesty. Yeah, so individual decisions and lifestyles, I guess a part of that would be also education. And it seems like education is severely lacking in like the common people to understand the kind of issues at stake here. And so most people go to the supermarket and look for the cheapest thing, or there's so many choices, but how many are really real choices? So I think my perspective on lifestyle changes, individual choices, is really about education. But I think that it can't just be up to the individual to go out and find where is that education. I think there's got to be a better job, and universities can be a place that's where that starts, as well as businesses, to provide that education. Yeah. Paige.
Not to beat a dead horse here, but I want to come back to the policy point of this, which is that I totally agree that individual action, individual choices around food and agriculture can certainly make a difference, and it's completely necessary. But I also feel like it's important to highlight that the individualization of climate change is corporate policy. Like this is what they want to do. Just the other day, I forget if it was Shell or Exxon made an Instagram post, and it was like, use our tool to calculate your climate footprint. And I'm like, you calculate your climate footprint. But so I think, we need people to shift their consuming behavior around food. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize people live complicated lives. Like people go to the grocery store, and sometimes it's even hard to think about the 3 meals, what you are going to eat that day, aside from where it comes from, how it's produced, what's the climate footprint of this piece of cheese you bought. So I think pushing that back onto policy is important, and though policy might be slow and imperfect, obviously the last 5 years are illustrative of that, it also is a big tool. It can cause big, sweeping change, and it can take some of the kind of that individual consumption choice out of the equation, not in a bad way, but more in kind of putting it back on where the problem was created and how we can do it in the most sweeping nature we can.
I was just going to mention an example. I was in France a couple of weeks ago speaking with the Danone food company, and learned while there about a French law requiring that school meals be sourced locally, sustainably, etc. And they have a database that the schools can report into, and then they give the information out. So we serve that function as a nonprofit here, but what if it was a law? We did call on the federal government to add value-based purchasing at the White House conference for federal food programs. But to the point of education, the French, I understand, also have, although I haven't seen it, but they have a grading system on labels to indicate how healthy the food is for people and planet. I just heard about it, so I would just encourage us all to look into it. But that's an interesting intervention that could bridge a lot of those gaps.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, one more thing. I think one kind of interesting question that we could ask is how could we make, value-based practices come across more clearly in our labeling and certification systems. Right now, one issue that we're facing with certifications is that it's just become kind of like a system of white noise. We have organic, all natural, regenerative organic, what have you. And I work in this space and I can tell you approximately what 3 of them mean. And so I think, if we were to come up with something a lot more concerted and clear and less white noisy, then potentially I could see that being a really great opportunity.
So shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask Jorge a question, and that is about with your work and interfacing with small local cultures. How do you see that kind of perspective of people coming from like either indigenous communities or just local communities that are just trying to raise food for themselves in their local communities, and how they're part of the solution and how there are barriers maybe for them?
Whoa.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It just in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So I guess to understand the question, just sort of their relationship, their
we're talking a lot about policy and top down and very U.S. centric at this moment, and some French centric, very Western European. But there are people like your background. Your heritage comes from different Latin countries and communities, and you're now working with people who are growing maize in small subsistence level. And it seems like there's a big disconnect between the forces that are trying to do good from one end and the forces that are just trying to do good at their local scale at the other end. And sometimes they don't mesh well. And I feel you must have experience with that interface.
Yeah, and I don't know if this will answer the question, but I mean, I think policy, obviously, you see it in real time, it's potential for change. But I think that this is enacted by constituents, and constituents are kind of at the mercy of brands and marketing and all of the cultural forces that exist that make us make decisions one way or another. And I think at the end of the day, if we're talking about food, it has to taste great. There has to be a compelling reason to be excited about it. It has to move you. It's an emotional tool, of mass manipulation. But I do think that at the end of the day, and for all of the complications of the institution of Blue Hill at Stone Barns today, which has kind of been involved in some problems of late, I still maintain that one of the most powerful things that happened there was, you would give a talk about, this single udder butter. It's kind of ridiculous even saying it out loud. And, just the virtues of regenerative agriculture and animal husbandry and how good it tasted. And if you were getting the good milk that night, it wasn't always a guarantee. But at the end of the day, you give that talk, and Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of Pepsi, is sitting at table 41. You've got another CEO or executive at another, Danone, Chobani, the founder and CEO, and they're all looking to all forms of culture to kind of understand where they need to position themselves. And I think that it's a part of an entire conversation. If there's interest, if there's cultural currency involved, even at a really small level, we're an incredibly small company. Large companies are taking note about how the conversation is shifting. And that to me is a win. It's not about disrupting it, which was sort of in my naive way, what I thought we could do with this type of supply chain. It's not going to disrupt it, but it does create an alternative that does, I think, move things toward center or a better version of itself. And farmers are inextricably linked in that. It's a model for how to approach sustainable agriculture vis-a-vis one of the most bastardized commodities in the world, corn. So if you can imagine a milpa growing in Iowa, and we can get kind of close to that, I think that's a pretty, that's a win. Don't think that answers the question, but it was 2 minutes.
No, well, I mean, I didn't have a real focused question. It was more a question about there's an issue here, and I'm trying to articulate it. Yeah. And something else that occurred to me while you were talking, thinking back to what you were describing your book earlier, is that nobody could really learn how to make masa unless you had grown up with somebody or somebody taught you. It was a tradition. And there are so many traditions around food that have been lost, but then like with your book, you're trying to preserve that and allow it to be learned and passed on to people who don't know anybody who knows that tradition. And in a way, I feel like there's always been this movement, or a lot of movement towards preserving, like linguists will try and preserve languages before they're lost. I feel like this is akin to that, and it's kind of keeping the variety of cultural practices alive that really made humans human. I mean, if you think about what makes humans different, is that we cook food, we cultivate food, we're about the way we process our food. It is processed food. That's what we've started, that's where we departed from our ape ancestry, is when we started actually processing either with Paleolithic technology of stone tools, moving on to domesticating crops and animals, and using fire, going back 1 million years. So up to the current era. And so unfortunately, with the industrialization, homogenization process, you can start to lose a lot of that rich culture and tradition that had accumulated over human evolutionary history and recent history. But we need to have people go back and try and preserve that.
Yeah, and I think, I think in the beginning of the work that I started to do with Hacienda, there was a bit of a savior complex, like it was our responsibility to save it. And there is a fine line there where I'm just interested in preserving culture. I'm interested in the effects of culture and what it did for me, and want to share that with others. But it's I think at the end of the day, it is the custodians of that tradition who have just as much of a say, probably more than anybody, and insofar as what we do with that and where it goes. Yeah, that one's a complicated one for sure, but I definitely feel the same. I feel romantically, attached to the tradition and want to see it persevere. At the end of the day, wisdom is a lot of what we're talking about with regards to regenerative agriculture, though it's set in a much more sort of modern context. We're talking about age-old traditions that have stood the test of time. Foods that we've figured out through trial and error just do better for the body, the microbiome.
And that's actually a great point, because I don't think a lot of people understand that, the kind of industrial corn might not be healthy, but this, like nixtamalization, that process actually turns something that has a lot of anti-nutrients like phytase and these chemicals that will prevent you from absorbing the nutrients, or maybe even doing harm to the digestive system. There are these traditional practices that take something that could potentially be harmful, and those cultural practices turn it into a very nutritious, bioavailable food. And I think that's often shortcut in the industrial process, rather than letting something ferment. Like ketchup used to be a fermented food. Now it's just producing, you add the high fructose corn syrup into it, and it's preserved. And so I think this idea of understanding the culture and these traditional practices around food, because it actually had a purpose health-wise, is another added benefit of trying to preserve this knowledge.
Can I bring up a policy point?
Yeah.
Because I agree completely. And one of the things we want to do is, again, try to help to bring that back. So in Hawaii, where I'm from, and I am part Hawaiian, there's been the decline of the production of taro. We call it kalo in Hawaii. And it's a very cosmologically sacred plant as well. It's considered a sibling to mankind, because of the relationship between man and plants and animals. And decline, but we'd like to help bring it back and have it be served, with the institutions that we work with, the departments of aging, schools. So what, this is a twinkle in an eye right now, but what if we could create an incentive fund, this would be policy, to help these institutions pay that premium for kalo, so they could buy it. It could create livelihoods for the farmers. What if we were to be able to create incentive funds for better produced, more genetically, it has genetic integrity crops? What if we did that in a number of places to help them get more to market and create viability for the farmers that are working so hard to produce them?
We'll take the money. Totally.
And so that's where policy meets,
Mm-hmm.
the world. And hopefully we can all start working toward that to see if we can make a difference there.
Yeah, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just really quick. I feel like I have to make a shout out. One of my mentors and friends, professor at UC Santa Barbara, Liz Carlisle, just recently wrote a book called Healing Grounds, and it's more about kind of ancestral regenerative practices and the lessons that we can learn from those traditional agricultural systems and what they mean for regenerative agriculture now. It takes you through some really great case studies, and I think we could all take some lessons from that. So anyway.
That sounds interesting. I need to get that book too.
Can I plug my podcast? If you listen to episodes 1 and 2, we discuss this.
All right.
too.
We have time for, I think, 2 more questions. We have 2 from the audience. I'm going to do the following order, and I'm going to pick this one first because I think it's a question that comes up a lot, and I think that the answers might surprise people. And so this will be directed at Paige because it's your wheelhouse. And the question is, do you look at methane emissions from grazing cows and how it compares with the soil carbon sequestration benefits? Some sort of cost-benefit analysis of that.
Yes and yes. The way we traditionally do that is through a method called life cycle analysis. And so that's essentially accounting for all of the greenhouse gas emissions emitted from an agricultural sector. In livestock and beef production, we do it what we call from cradle to farm gate. So that's including enteric methane production, nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer, carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. And so we aggregate all of those greenhouse gas emissions into what we call a carbon dioxide equivalent. And actually, during my master's work, I did that and also measured soil carbon sequestration from a regenerative grazing system that we were experimenting at Michigan State University at the Ag Bio Research Center there. And what we found was that, at least in the finishing phase, the carbon sequestration was so high. Now, this isn't a short time frame. It's not the entire greenhouse gas footprint. But the carbon sequestration was high enough to offset a decent amount of those emissions. That might not, some caveats, that might not always be the case. Not all grazing systems are regenerative. Grazing does produce methane. We can't get around that. There are a lot of, things to think about here. But I think the top thing that I would highlight with regards to soil carbon sequestration and grazing is that I'm not suggesting that, we increase our greenhouse gas footprint by producing more of our meat from grazing systems. What I'm suggesting is to align our beef and meat production with planetary goals. So how much beef can we produce using regenerative grazing systems to maximize our soil carbon sequestration and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are attributed to fossil fuels within that production system. And I do think that regenerative grazing in that way is kind of a win-win-win because we can do all of those things.
Very nice, succinct answer. Also, you didn't mention it, but my understanding is that methane, it stays about 10 years in the atmosphere before it's taken back up, and carbon is like thousands of years?
Well, methane is part carbon, CH4.
Right.
So methane is what we call a short-lived climate pollutant. It does have a half-life in the atmosphere of about 10 years, whereas carbon dioxide stays for much, much longer. That's taken into consideration a little bit when we're converging all of the greenhouse gas emissions into that CO2 equivalent. It does not do a great job of it, though. So because these gases exist for different periods of time in the atmosphere, there are ongoing bodies of research to kind of flesh through how we do that better and how we better kind of capture that when we're doing our life cycle analysis. And right now, it's certainly not a consensus that we've reached just yet. The kind of double-edged sword when it comes to methane is that because it is short-lived, some would consider it, a less important climate pollutant because it's not staying there so long. But on the other hand, any mitigation efforts we take toward mitigating methane will have a short-term cooling effect. So we get a lot more bang for our buck by investing short-term in mitigating methane than we do CO2. But also, I don't want to say that to suggest that we don't need to focus on CO2 because we certainly do.
Right. There's no one target to look at.
Right. And I think, thinking about the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted from fossil fuels that are rather than just the, methane that's cycling within enteric fermentation from grazed animals is another important kind of way to hone in on where the problem is actually coming from.
Excellent. So we have one more question, and this is really for all the panel members. It's a great closing question. This is from the audience. Looking into the future, what other alternatives or complements do each of you panelists envision in our future food system? Beyond regenerative approaches, what are about other ways of growing food or alternative proteins? So who wants to jump at that one first? Yeah, maybe. Jorge?
My answer, I think, is just very short. I think the more you connect, I think 2020, despite being a kind of complicated year globally, was kind of interesting because we were all doing stuff that we hadn't done before, and we're like, damn, that bread was really time consuming to make. Like I should be a little more thoughtful about how much bread I eat or what kind of bread I eat. And I think that in a nugget that we've had very, very near term like amnesia about what just happened. We're all in this room. It's great to see everybody. I think it's really interesting to think about that idea of active consumption and what that does when you're squarely placed in the role of just like creating your meal for yourself from as scratch as possible. Not to say you have to like go Portlandia on your chicken, but like maybe one day it's like fun to know where they come from. It's like where they live. So I think as much as you can kind of connect with that process, the more you have an appreciation for it, and the more you can kind of tailor, more sustainable, purchasing decisions and consumption decisions on a daily basis. But that's what keeps me excited.
I think what excites me and what I feel like we could really think about when we're re-envisioning the future of food and ag is thinking about slightly decentralizing the emphasis that we place on yield in our agricultural production systems and rethinking them in terms of multifunctional agricultural systems. The landscapes that produce our food, the farmers and ranchers that produce our food, it's not just about yields. It's about maintaining the integrity of the landscape, sequestering soil carbon. It's about maintaining biodiverse ecosystems. Right now, with the way that our industrial agricultural systems are crafted, that's not possible. We've created industrial policy such that we have these outcomes because it is so yield focused. Now, saying that, often at the beginning of people's talks, you'll hear them say something like, we need to feed however many billion people by 2050. That is still a fact of life. And so we still need to be thinking about yields, but thinking about these other things in tandem, I think would do us some good.
Yeah, I agree. To build on that, I think it's 9 or 10 billion that we have to feed, but we already have enough calories produced in the world to feed the world. It's just not equitably distributed. And there are enough smallholder farmers to actually feed the world should they be given the opportunity. And a lot of this is about distribution. So what I think about is the system. I'm not a producer of food. I definitely want to create opportunity for those who are producing food in a way that's climate conscious and people conscious. So I think of the system, and that's why I talk about a 30% system, because right now it's about 5 to 15% in local. And local is not the only answer. In California, local can mean a lot of things. In Hawaii, local means smallholder farms, and it means regenerative practices, but it's different in every region. But what I'd like to see is a community-based food system at least 30%. So what I'd like to see is more resilience, where we have, say, a village overlay on the global system. So each region has a strong connection to the local growing environment, and that local environment, growing environment, has a strong connection to earth-respectful growing practices and a strong respect for the workers that are part of that system all along the line. All of that, to me, is so important, and that's what I think of as a community-based system. And if we could get to at least 30% by 2030, I'd be happy, and I hope that gets us to getting even more of the way there.
I'll mirror what most people said by pointing out that all of these mouths that will need to be fed today and will need to be fed in the future are predominantly in urbanized areas. And so what we're observing is that there's a greater and greater convergence of technology and agriculture and food production that maybe doesn't take place in rural landscapes, but is shifting slowly or quickly, depending on how much like investment money from SoftBank is being put towards it, towards more urban areas. And so you see things like in Downey, the production of shrimp, in farms that are being sold to restaurants and grocery stores, or in Northern California, a lot of aquaculture that is taking place in areas that are very far removed from the ocean, in which they might be growing actually multiple types of plants and animals within a common facility. So, for instance, sturgeon for caviar being grown underneath microgreens and other types of high price crops inside of buildings, closer to where the end consumer is going to use them, potentially even with greater amount of, let's say, human intervention in removing the elements of the cow or the I think they're doing duck that is, produced within chambers within a laboratory, and the amount of waste that is typically required, and processing and labor and so forth for proteins is probably something that is going to go away, at least in a large part. And so the question becomes then, what does that relationship between the urbanized areas and the landscapes that have for a long time, whether they're in Hawaii and or in Iowa, that have been so sort of identified with the production of either a specific crop or a particular way of working on production of maize at small scale throughout Mexico and other parts of Central America. How does that get preserved or kept in one way or another? And there's some really interesting models for that. If you look in, for instance, Italy or Northern California, in the Point Reyes seashore, where there's an overlay of cultural heritage and landscape preservation, while intentionally allowing or incentivizing for certain cultural practices and activities to continue. And so that sort of convergence between technology and the people that are producing it, when the robots take over, which they very much are. I mean, like Davis is investing huge amounts of money in dealing with not only a history of exploitation, of immigrant labor, of really terrible conditions, but also just there's all of this new technology that can be much more receptive, much more controllable. I mean, all the things that agriculture and food sort of has struggled with in order to have control over, whether it's in a negative way in controlling how large scale feedlots and so forth are produced. But it seems like that process is still in taking place, and maybe in different ways than it has in the past.
And it's going to continue to take place. These were really great responses to this. I want to wrap up on that with my own little piece on this, and that is, as we were talking about before the panel started, there's like a company up in Van Nuys, I think, that's making cricket protein. They grow crickets. So think about the biomass of insects or other things on this planet that is actually nutritious food, thinking of especially proteins. There's companies out there now that are making crickets and making a protein powder that they can use that's very nutritious. And they could be grown in an urban setting. And then there's the education piece. I always come back to that, being a professor. In fact, when my daughters were in elementary school and they have this little fall festival where all the teachers set up booths for their classrooms, well, my friend and I set up a booth where we pan-roasted, sauteed crickets and gave them out in little Dixie cups. You can turn in the ticket and get a little cup of crickets to eat. Just to raise awareness at a small scale, kids and their parents, about the different kind of things that could be food. And just to open our minds a little bit more. And I think that's what this panel has helped achieve, is just open our minds a little bit more, get a little bit more information out there about how we're trying to solve these problems. And there's no final solutions, but I think these are some great starts and a lot of progress is being made. So let's thank our panelists again, and thank you, Amy, for having all of this together.
Wonderful. And thank you all for coming tonight, and an amazing discussion, so lively, insightful, and sets the stage for many future events, I think, to come, right? Where there's so many great topics that came out of the discussion tonight that we'll have to follow up on with future events here at UCLA. So thank you all for coming, and have a good evening.